I'm Sylvester Johnson. At Virginia Tech, where I serve as Assistant Vice Provost for the Humanities and work in the Department of Religion and Culture. I'm delighted to be here with my colleague who is going to be moderating this panel with me, Professor Catherine Gerbner, who's a member of the Department of History at the University of Minnesota, with her work exploring the dimensions of race, authority, and freedom in the early modern Atlantic world. Our discussants on this panel are Dr. Diane Stewart, who is a professor of religion and African American studies at Emory University, specializing in African heritage, religious cultures in the Caribbean and the Americas. We also have Alexis Wells of Gogome, who is an assistant professor of religious studies, whose teaching and research explore the intersections of race, religion, and gender in the United States. And as a historian of African American religion, she specializes in the religiosity of enslaved peoples. And we also have Dr. J. Cameron Carter, who is a scholar of African American religions, working at the intersection of race and current ecological ravaging of the earth, interested in what these issues have to do with our modern world generally, and with America. We're very excited to have these discussions with us. And I want to remind all of our audience members that at about 1:30, we're going to take questions from you. So at any time, you can click on that Q&A link at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can at any time pop some questions into there. Those will go in our queue. We'll be eager to hear from you and to make that part of our conversation this evening. So let's get going, and I'll turn to you, Kat.
Thank you so much, Sylvester, for that introduction. And thank you so much to our panelists here for joining us for what I'm sure is going to be an excellent conversation. I also want to thank the ASCH for organizing this, and the University of Minnesota for organizing and sponsoring this. So we are going to start off with a few questions that will each be directed to one of the panelists, but then we'll sort of open up each question as we go to a broader conversation between the panelists. So the first question, I think I'm gonna direct it first to Dr. Diane Stewart, but feel free to jump in, Alexis and Jay, as you would like. So the Black Church PBS documentary that we're discussing today is really monumental. It explains the 400-year history of the Black Church. And what I want to start off by asking is it fair to say that the Black Church, for many Americans, is really synonymous with Black religion?
You're still on mute. So.
Thank you. I'm so sorry about that. Thank you so much, Catherine, for posing that question, and to Sylvester, my co-panelists, for having me as a part of this program today. It's a real pleasure. Yeah, it's a question I think about a lot. And I'm going to begin by saying, not for Black people who are not Christian, right? For Black people who are not Christian, they know that it's not fair to say that the Black Church is synonymous with Black religion. But you're right, for many Americans, I would say yes, right? Including African Americans who are Christian. It's the only religious tradition and heritage that African descendants had public permission to develop as a formal institution historically. And to be sure, we live in a country and I live in a region of America in particular where many people associate the term religion with Christian, right? Especially Protestantism. So when it comes to Blacks, when people have broader understandings of Black religion, they might think of Islam, right? And in some Black neighborhoods, folks will think of Black ethnic and nationalist religions as well. But the majority of images, scholarly texts, media stories, and documentaries about Black religion feature the Black Church or some aspect of African American Christianity exclusively or predominantly. So I think it's unfortunate because I think it's a limited, it's not a comprehensive picture of Black religiosity. And it's something that we scholars can and should do something about. So I would say, I think, yes, most Americans, or many Americans, certainly do imagine something Christian when they think about Black religion.
Thank you. And yeah, so just building off of that great answer, and you can sort of take this second question, Diana or Alexis or Jay, if you want to jump in, but what difference does it make, for instance, when we shift our lens to Islam, as you were mentioning, or something like Orisha devotion versus sort of thinking about the Black church?
Mm-hmm. No, it's really important, because I try to teach my students about the comprehensive religious diversity, the plurality of African religious traditions that influence Black religious formation in the United States. And I've had to, in the last 10 years or so, give a lot more attention to Islam. I'm not an expert in it. It's not what I really teach, but I've had to bring conversations about Islam into my teaching because we have long ignored it. When the lens is Islam, I think we reconceive our historical understanding of the religious beginnings of African descendants in the United States and the historical religious diversity of West and West Central African religion. We can begin to ask a number of other questions. When the lens is Orisha, and for that matter, any other African heritage religious culture, Orisha provides a window into concepts and orientations that govern African cultural and spiritual life and belonging. And I'm speaking here of belonging to more than just people groups. I'm also including what it means to belong to the natural world, to one's ancestors, to one's Ori, which is one's personal deity, and to the ensemble of the sacred called the Orisha. So it's a totally different mapping of a spirituality. And I often say to my students, I don't care if your whole world is Christian. Everything is about Christianity. I can quote my former advisor, James Cone. My parents were Christian. I'm not leaving this religion. You need religious literacy in Africana religions, period. You can't just know, in order to even know your own Christianity better, you need to know about African heritage religions. So there's so much to learn and to think about, especially in this time when we're talking about climate change and saving our planet. And many of the African heritage religions are really about understanding the codes of the natural world so that we can live in community with it. And so I think there's still a lot for us to learn. So that lens, I think, is important for contemporary discussions about ecological survival, about other inhabitants of the earth beyond people. And so it can be very, very helpful. We understand how power, both visible and invisible, shape a common life for Omo Orisha or Orisha religious devotees when we use this lens to examine Black religion. And we can also understand the commonalities among Orisha traditions and other African heritage traditions, but also among Orisha traditions and Christianity, Orisha traditions and Buddhism, Orisha traditions and Hinduism, Orisha traditions and Islam. And to me, the ultimate thing, which I think is so interesting, if we take North America as an example, is the way African heritage religions or religious phenomena, such as sacred medicines, like the one Sandy Jenkins gave Frederick Douglass, and spiritual ways of knowing and responding to the world shaped and helped to repurpose the legacies of Islam's and Christianities, not only in Africa, but also here in the United States and the wider diaspora, right? And I think someone like Cheryl Townsend Gilks' amazing 2014 article, With My Face to the Rising Sun, where she examines the Islamic foundations of African-American Christianity, is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. But if we see these traditions as just discrete institutions that have nothing to do with each other, we miss an authentic understanding of the formation and unfolding and proliferation of African-American religions in this country.
Thank you. Alexis or Jay, I don't know if either of you want to jump in here. Jay, you've unmuted yourself, so.
I was only unmuted because of before, but since you called me out, I'll say something. No, I just would underscore all of this. I think an important point among many points that were explicit and implicit in what Professor Stewart has said is that something massive is at stake if you just collapse Christianity or even Black Christianity into Black religion. One of the things that the very formulation Black religion does is it desediments the way in which Christianity as a kind of, the way in which Christianity sort of shapes what we now call the modern world through colonial practice, enslavement, and so on and so forth, has overdetermined all manner of things, how we relate to the earth, how we relate to each other, the terms by which we relate to each other, the dynamics of a kind of exclusionary inclusion. Black folk excluded, shall we say, from the normative, a normative place in the body politic, but included in order to generate labor and so on and so forth to build the what is called the modern world. Of course, working in relationship with settler colonial theft of the land. Christianity had an outsized role in that, and in its outsized role, it functioned to individuate, atomize, and kind of like reduce things to like units for consumption and ownership. That's a religious orientation. Now, the minute you say Black religion, you're already announcing some sort of disturbance, in pushing back against that, right? Black religion, if nothing else, in its plurality, the plurality of institutions that one can think inside that category, and the pluralities that are irreducible to institutions that one can think inside of that category. The minute you do that, you are announcing a kind of pressure back into the semiotic order. And if you collapse Black religion into Christianity and not appreciate the ways in which what happens to Christianity when it meets the phenomenon of Black people and Blackness, a whole series of things become unthinkable. And so it's one of the ways in which I'm sort of seizing upon and hearing the important kind of account of the distinction between Christianity, even Black Christianity and Black religion, and not collapsing those things into each other. I'll say one more thing. One of the other kind of at the level of thought, knowing, and knowledge or epistemology, one of the other violences of the ways in which kind of colonialistic performance of Christianity, what it has done is that it has robbed us of the ability to appreciate the multiplicity that surges through the category of religion. It's almost robbed us of the ability to think that category. And so there's the insistence that comes with the category of Black religion is it's an epistemological insistence that goes with it. It opens up new horizons of knowing and possibilities of thought. I go so far as to say it releases thought, right? Rather than enclosing us into various types of epistemological obediences.
Wow, yes. And actually, listening to your answer, I was just telling Alexis, I'm halfway through her incredible book, which for those of you who haven't seen it, The Souls of Women Folk. And, Alexis, I don't know if you want to say, sort of build on this, but also I noticed in your book that you make this choice not to talk about specific, you don't organize by specific religious traditions, right? So, and I hear sort of in Jay's comment, sort of, this larger point about epistemologies and religion. So yeah, I don't know if that's the direction you would want to go, but that's something that came to mind as I've been listening to this incredible conversation.
Yeah, no, I mean, honestly, Professor Stewart and Carter just gave, amazingly thorough answers to that. And I will just say, the one thing I will add very briefly is the question of sources, because when we're looking at books and documentaries like The Black Church, we have to ask the question of how are sources determining the histories we tell. And one of the most important things to recall about these epistemological, methodological, and historical reorientations is that when we access the religiosity of African descended peoples in what is now known as the United States outside of the Christian paradigm, we're also accessing some of the earliest sources and accounts of what these people who will then eventually become known as Black people are doing in these spaces. And I completely agree with Professor Carter's response that epistemologically, it's a really important reorientation, and it changes the way I think it liberates how we can write and think about what people were doing. And the question is always, what happens to the histories and historiography when we start with multiplicity, when we start with plurality, when we start with West and West Central African traditions, even if those traditions are Abrahamic faiths like Islam or Christianity, what happens when we start the story there? And how does that change the arc of the narrative? And I think to the point, it allows us to access much earlier histories, and it allows us to, I think, sit with the brilliance of African descended people and the extent to which they innovated, adapted, and made conscientious choices about what they were going to reconstruct in this land in response to enslavement and the other conditions of unfreedom that they found themselves in.
Thank you so much.
Oh, I'm sorry. Would you allow me just to
Yeah.
on one very, very briefly here, one more thing that I heard so beautifully just articulated, and that is this. I mean, new vistas of knowing open up when we dwell with Black religion in its non-reduction to Black Christianity, or to Christianity / Black Christianity as well. The other thing that opens up, it strikes me as I was listening to Professor Wells, and I'm so frightened to pronounce your last name because I don't want to mess up. So I'm going to just say Alexis, but please know that this is no disrespect. But another thing that you said that struck me is both the horizons of knowing that open up, beginning with the multiplicities of knowing that open up, and I'm a sort of philosopher of religion, so please forgive me if I use these big old clunky words, but another kind of ontology opens up. That is to say that the ways in which we view ourselves differently open up. That is to say, Black religion provides a vehicle and a mechanism to think our own multiplicity and not to think our own singularity. And for me, one of the greatest violence is the way in which a colonized practicing of Christianity does is it atomizes things. It reduces us, makes us think we're just one thing. No, we're more than one. The earth is more than one, right? We're inside of these cycles in which matter is constantly cycling and recycling itself. And with each cycling and recycling, the earth itself is more than what it was, just as the universe is more than what it was. And it strikes me that much about African performed religiosities, they had some sense about this. They tapped into this, and when we think the genius of Black religion, we're also thinking about that continuity that opens us up to the multiplicity of ourselves, right? This kind of, Glissant said, the consent not to be a single being. Right? That consent towards non-singularity, that multiplicity, is all about what Black religion is about.
Well, that is great. It actually moves us to another question we have for all of you. And Jay, I'm wondering, maybe you can get us started this question, but it has to do with whether you think there is any significant differences between this category of the Black church on the one hand and US Black Christianity on the other. So one of the interesting things about this documentary, the PBS documentary, is its rich engagement with the history that precedes the Black church in the United States during what will become the United States. So there's attention toward African religions and even Christian forms of religion in Africa. There's a lot of work that has been done to bring some narratization, some story structure to this history, and the documentary does that really well. It does that by focus on the United States on the whole, even though there are important gestures and connections to areas beyond the United States. And so it really is a great setup for this question, because there are very different forms of attention toward diaspora, the idea of global traditions. And so I'm wondering if the three of you could talk about what your thoughts are, the Black church versus U.S. Black Christianity, and is there any significant difference there? So Jay, get us started.
Okay, I love this question. It's a question that it's always trailing me. It's always in front of me and always behind me at the same time. I'm constantly thinking about some version of this question. And so I will just come at it this way because it is such a rich question. And just want to first underscore that in my view, I do think in terms of a distinction between US Christianity and the Black church. I'm going to add two more categories in just a second, but let me just work with that for now. I do see a kind of distinction between what we call US Black Christianity and the Black church. One way in which I try and process or maybe play around with that distinction is I often think of US Black Christianity as a regional expression of what might be called Black church, which can include US Christianity, but again, is not reducible to it, which then allows me to then have to think about, how do I think about the capaciousness then of something called the Black church and not collapse it into US Black Christianity. So that's the first thing, that I want to hold that distinction, and I want to think about US Black Christianity as something of a regional expression of a phenomenon that we might call the Black church, even as we also say the Black church is not simply equatable with what we might call Black Christianity in the United States. But then that backs me up to, okay, well, how do you think about the Black church? Here, I want to add another category. I've been increasingly trying to think past the definite article, the, and the capital B and the capital C, the Black church, because there's a way in which the Black church, putting that definite article in front of it, kind of like reifies that institution. And then you can collapse it into something maybe in the US or something anywhere. Anywhere can come to own that category. I want to desediment even the notion of the Black church by really thinking more rigorously and unharnessing the term church itself from ecclesiastical overdetermination. The category church in many ways has been overdetermined, in my view, by ecclesiastical dictates. So the Black church being the Baptist church or whatever have you. But again, the word church functioning within the kind of theological conceptual sphere of an ecclesiastical institution. But what if we backed up and thought about church, like kind of in its kind of, Greek kind of language etymological roots, the ecclesia. It's a social organization, the sociality of those who've been called out. Those who've been drawn out from one kind of way of imagining the socius into some other way of imagining the socius. It's a term of sociality. So now, if I just think about it just on that level and not run too quick to the ecclesiastical and the theological, I've now got something I might be able to work with, because I can think about the ways in which Black folk had to forge new socialities. We might call this diasporic socialities in any number of ways. It's unified precisely in its internal differentiality. It's the unity of ongoing difference, different ways of socially connecting, constructing belonging that is not simply reducible to the ecclesiastical determinations of social kind of, constructs. Now, if I think Black church in that way, drop the definite article and release that word church from the ecclesiastical overdeterminations that might block out this, that, and the other, which often rides in relationship to nation state formations and border logics of countries. If I can get past that, now I got a way of thinking and living towards and living into and being some sort of proponent of alternative imaginations of the social. And it's in that sense that I both want to then think the Blackness of Black church and the churchiness, or to use a Rastafarianism, the churchicality, if I can turn it into an adjective, the churchicality of Black people, without then dictating that means you're in that institution called the Christian church or whatever have you. So I'm going basically from US Black Christianity to the Black church, but then I want to release that as well, because I think in many respects, that formulation, the Black church, is what drives Gates's narrative. I appreciate what it does, don't get me wrong, but I think it's the conceptual driver. But if I can back up and think not just the Black church, but perhaps with Ruby Sales, Black church, in its non-reduction to ecclesiastical institutional formation, I've now got a way to think radical sociality that for me includes a new kind of ecological social order that connects with the environment, with the earth, and new ways of thinking our relationships to each other thereby.
Alexis?
I'd actually love to jump in if Alexis
Yes, go
wants
ahead,
to,
Diane. Yes, absolutely.
because I wasn't even going to go down this road, but Jay just took me down here. I wasn't going to mention this book, but a number of you know that Tracy Hudson and I have been working on this joint project. It's going to be out next year. I think there might be something at the AAR about it. But that sociality, Jay, that you talk about, okay, first of all, it returns us to Du Bois, and some of what he was doing. We know that there were all kinds of politics and respectability reasons that he needed to come up with the concept of the Negro church, right? And that social scientists needed to study it and say to all the romantic racists and all the, really grotesque racists, we are actually studying this church scientifically. And guess what? You're wrong. This is what's really going on. Okay, got that. But it's interesting that you talked about the nation state, because what I do in my volume, which is on Orisha tradition, I re-theorize. I hope I put the punctuation mark on the concept of syncretism. I hope that people will just leave that alone and let that go after they read chapter 2. I really hope so. But what do I do instead? I saw 5 major themes that just were coming out of everywhere. It was coming out of the historical ethnography in Herskovitz archives. It was coming out of my own original ethnography. It was coming out of the archives. It was coming out of what Tracy and I were observing. She likes to use the language of participant engagement. It was coming out of everywhere. And these themes were sovereignty, nation, or nationhood, not the nation state though, which is why I italicize it. I italicize it everywhere I use it in my book, because I am not talking about political state formations. So nationhood, kinship and family, social belonging, and what I'm calling motherness, matricentricity or motherness. I kind of define that a little differently. But what I do in the last chapter is, and I do this on purpose, I literally analyze the Black church as a space, as an institution that also embodies these themes. And I specifically focus on the nation theme in ways that we don't usually talk about in religion. And I bring in the social scientists who helped us to see that earlier on, but even very just understudied, underused data from some of them to really open this up. And so that's sociality. I use that language a lot in the book. That sociality that you're talking about, that was theorized, I think, and expressed under the concept of the nations. I mean, this idea, people might look at me and say, okay, why are you bringing this up? Nation is such a problematic word. No, it's an Africana heritage word. They were not calling themselves tribes. They were not calling themselves people groups. They were calling themselves nation. And they would refer to their homelands as country. They would say my country or my nation. And it's all over my book. So you will see it. So I think it's really important for us to understand the nation. And I argue it's not reducible to race or ethnicity. Those terms are not able to conceptualize what the nation is. And so it's not just that the Orisha nation, the Yoruba nation in Trinidad was active and organizing a people, their sociality. So was the Black church. So was the Black church. So I thought I had to bring it up because you went there, and I think it's critical. And I think more scholars of religion need to take up the Black church as nation. Those nations were not just the Angola, the Jeje and the Nago Candomblé houses. They were not just the Kumina nation in Jamaica. They were not just the Lukumi nations in Cuba. They were the Black denominational nations as well. So I think I'm hoping that people will find it appealing and compelling and actually do more work in that regard. But there's something else too. If can I go on just a little bit more? There's something else too. And this is I'm very passionate about this because it's in studying African heritage religions in Jamaica that I came to this awareness. Certainly we studied this stuff in graduate school and all that, right? And in undergrad, but to really understand what's going on here, when we look at the movements of people of African descent in the diaspora, and even in conversation or in movement with people on the continent, of course, the Black church is not just a US phenomenon. Of course, it's not just a Christian phenomenon. When we look at Bishop Henry McNeil Turner and his activities over in South Africa, and what was going on with the Fisk Jubilee singers going over to South Africa and Africans coming here and studying, there were exchanges going on. They were influencing nationalist Christian movements in Africa and vice versa. When we look at the movement of African-American loyalists out of the Southeastern US and even higher up, going to places like Jamaica in the 1780s and bringing the Baptist tradition there, this is not just a US phenomenon. When we look at them also after the War of 1812, this is what my current book project is on. After the War of 1812, going to Trinidad and settling in those company villages, it's the people, and it's not just George Lyle, these are entourages. I mean, Black folks are moving at this time. They're trying to find home spaces. They're trying to find homelands that can welcome them and shield them from the terror of whiteness in America. So when we look at what they're doing, I want to give an example. I pulled this out on purpose. In 1889, H.E. Shakespeare Woods, a Black man from America who gained fame as a prophet while living in a cave, called together, this is in Jamaica, a religious assembly in Augusttown near Kingston. Shakespeare selected 12 men and 12 women who swore on a Bible placed on top of a jar of water. Do I need to even go further with that? Okay, on top of a jar of water from the nearby Hope River, that they would devoutly serve God. These were the first elders of the Jamaica Native Baptist Free Church. One of them, Alexander Bedward, would soon become the best known revivalist in the colony and a popular champion of Black nationalism. Bedward had the kind of allegiance that Marcus Garvey had amongst poor rural Blacks in the US. He had that. My grandmother was a Bedwardite. Everybody was my great-grandmother. Everybody loved Bedward, everybody. And Bedward comes out of this African-American founded community. So we can never, ever talk about the Black church as not a cross diaspora, transnational, let me say transnational, because that's how I pronounce national in my nation italicized, a transnational phenomena. You'll see it, it's coming out in that book. Yeah, we have to, that's just one example. There's so many examples of this. When I think about, and some of this is through the racism, right? The racism of the European Baptists, in Jamaica, who said, "Oh, we're not going to send our white missionaries over to Ghana and West Africa. Let's send them. Let's send these Jamaican ones. Yes, we're training them, but they're not superior enough to handle and to manage their own affairs here. We'll send them to Africa." Well, sending them to Africa was doing some things, you know. So this is a transnational, international phenomenon, and you know, scholars, we need to do more work on this.
Alexis, any thoughts to add?
Well, great answers. I will just say very, very briefly, I agree. And I think one thing that I think we all can appreciate about what Professor Gates was doing in the documentary and in the book is giving us, I think, a good narrative of the Black church as an institutional phenomenon. So of course, there are limitations to that, which have already been stated. But one of the things that cannot be denied when we talk about these institutional expressions of Black Christianity is how its amazing role in the formation of Black educational institutions, which is highlighted. Also, it's a function as a platform for the emergence of very visible community, oftentimes male, but community leaders until, once we get to Virginia Broughton and Nannie Helen Burroughs, and then, that's when you see the women showing up, even though I think if we shift that paradigm away from the institutional phenomenon, then we see, going back to the first question, we get a window into the amazing diversity of historical actors who created spaces of sociality, and who use these spaces, because I think there's a way, at least, to think about Black churches just as physical spaces, because they're very significant as physical spaces, as spaces in which U.S. Black Christianity can be is being incubated, but they're also spaces where other religious traditions are forming and being incubated. They're sites where people are able to socialize. And I think, especially when we talk about sociality, is so, of course, central for me, being someone who is interested in earlier periods. I mean, on a more basic and fundamental level, these provided space, just physical space for people to see one another outside of plantations, outside of farms, outside of the businesses that they worked for, where they, especially if you were, a person, a domestic enslaved person, you could lead a very isolated life. And so if you got the opportunity to socialize with other enslaved people and free people, this was an opportunity to form relationships, friendships, very basic, elemental human things, human relationships were being fostered in these spaces. So I think understanding it as a site of sociality, as a site where West and West Central African ritualistic and hierarchical structures could find expression, as aesthetic sites, which is something Professor Gates does so well, I think, in the book and the documentary, highlighting the importance of cultural and aesthetic expression to the history of the Black church as an institutional phenomenon, because quite frankly, I don't know if anybody would have went if there wasn't singing, if there wasn't, expression. I don't think it would have been nearly as successful. So it's very important. This is an important feature of it as an institutional phenomenon, but also as a social space. And I think I agree wholeheartedly with the previous responses. Thinking of it in terms of socialities not only enables us to think about, for me at least, a much more robust and, I think, true cast of historical actors, but it also gives us that Africana framework when we are reminded that there are ways of relating that African descended peoples were bringing with them, and they were just reproducing them, and they were just finding spaces to reproduce them in. And oh, by the way, this is the hegemonic religion of the state. This is the hegemonic religion of the planter class. But we can also use this as a space in which we can recreate and remember and reconstruct the structures that are familiar to us and that help us to build, maintain and build communities. So I think there are lots of different ways. I think we're thinking about the Black church on many different levels. But I do want to highlight, just going back to the documentary, thinking about it more expansively does not negate the importance of its institutional history.
Could I just add one thing, Sylvester? You might remember this from way back. Something that I've never forgotten, that Dr. James Washington, one of the most important persons to my dissertation work back at Union, he died 3 weeks before I defended my dissertation, but I had one of the best independent studies. He's the first person that told me about Africans, Yorubas, and people that were originally from Dahomey going back to West Africa from Brazil. He's the first person who told me about that. I had no idea until he told me about that. But he said, Diane, don't think about the National Baptist Convention per se. Think about it as a movement. Don't think about Black Baptist tradition as an institution right away. Think about it as a movement. And I think at that time I needed that. I needed to hear that because I was, working on what was going on with the Baptists in Jamaica, and then also reading his book, Frustrated Fellowship. And it was just really powerful. We often think about Black ethnic and nationalist religions as movements, but what does it also mean to think about the Black church as a movement? And in this case, he was talking particularly about the NBC, the National Baptist Convention, USA. And especially when we think about things like the Negro Convention movement, right? And how central the Black church, Black churches were to that movement and what was going on. It's just incredible.
Thank you, all of you, for those really, these answers they're blowing my mind. It's really a wonderful discussion. I am going to ask one more question, and then I just want to remind those listening that we will turn to Q&A. So if you do have questions, please pop it in the Q&A. So this question is I'll direct it to Dr. Wells Agogome, but the other panelists may jump in. So I want to turn to a major theme, freedom, which is among sort of the dominant threads that's featured in the documentary and the book, and of course is a major theme throughout so much work on the Black church. Can you talk about the role of freedom and its others in the history of the Black church? And specifically, I'm wondering if you could talk about whether you think it would be an exaggeration to say that freedom is the defining feature of the Black church, or would this sort of obscure more than it reveals?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's a big question. And I suspect that there's someone else on the Zoom that knows a lot about freedom and democracy and colonialism. So I just want to point that out. But I will take a crack at it. So in terms of whether or not it's the defining feature, I think for me, it goes back to that question of whether or not we're equating the Black church with Black US Christianity. And really, I would go even deeper to say whether or not how we're defining Christianity and how African descended people, Black people claim it at various moments in history. Because, to be very clear, there are ways that, going back all the way back to the earlier point of how this framework can overdetermine what we see. There are times when, freedom can do the same thing. And also, just understanding freedom within this dialectic of the free and unfree. So I'm going to quote Professor Sylvester Johnson here, because I think when he talks about freedom as racial property, as a type of racial property, that's really important because, it gives at least a way into understanding the developments we see in Black and Christian institutional culture later on. Because, freedom only becomes legible within this dialectic of the unfree. And so what are the qualities and traits that are ascribed to the free and then to the unfree? Professor Gerbner, you do this work as well when you talk about Protestantism and how, early on, there are certain Protestant actors to whom freedom is assigned. These are free actors. Free actors are Protestant Christians of a certain class. But then when we add that racial layer, freedom becomes associated with whiteness. And I would also add heteronormativity. And so this association, ascribe whiteness, freedom in this way is embodied. So when we talk about whiteness and heteronormativity, we're talking about the ways of certain political capital, social, economic capital are assigned to certain bodies in our culture, in our society. So I think that's why when we get to the point in which that free unfree dialectic is no longer extant post Emancipation Proclamation and then really post 1865 into the Civil War. I guess we can take it all the way up to Juneteenth. But, you know, once we get to that point where people are free, then the question becomes, what does freedom look like for Black people? How are they enacting freedom? And in many ways, you know, this is where those tensions that Gates talks about, and I think that we all, as scholars of African American religion or Africana religions, that we tell within the historical arc, the narrative arc, you know, you have these freed people and free people who are now able to come in contact. You have those missionaries from the AME Church coming down into the South and encountering the religious expressions and religiosity of formerly enslaved people. And there are going to be tensions there because freedom and freedom's attachment to whiteness means education, it means enfranchisement, but it also means certain social values, respectability politics, and all these things that we begin to talk about at the turn of the 20th century. And so, for better or worse, that stuff shows up in the institutional Black church. It also shows up, you know, in the culture that is keeping women out of leadership in a lot of these big denominations. You have your exceptions like Jarena Lee, but for the most part, you have women who are occupying the you know, of course, the pews, the proverbial pews, and, you know, the pulpit is occupied by men. And then also heteronormativity comes with also just a disavowal or a failure to acknowledge the sexual diversity of Black people. And so I think in that way, you know, when you look at the institutional culture, and then when we get to where Gates ends up, thinking about Black Lives Matter and the sort of disillusionment that is being signaled by millennials, this amorphous group of people called millennials. I think that's what the response is to these understandings of freedom within these paradigms that are really very much still tethered to the free, unfree dialectic, this understanding that Black people have to perform a certain heteronormative whiteness, for better or worse, to be free. So I think in that way, you know, if I'm going to be a skeptic, then sure, freedom is a big part of Black institutional culture. But I think if we go back to the previous answer, and this is where I'm going to conclude, about thinking about sociality instead of just the institutional thread, then I don't think freedom is the primary paradigm through which we need to think, because things like pleasure are also very important. And I think we run the risk, when we just use freedom, we run the risk of really reifying that slave, free, unfree tension that people are essentially trying to escape. So it's kind of a both and sort of answer. I do think freedom is critically important to understanding this history. I think what the documentary and the book does so well is sort of crescendo, into the 20th century and the civil rights movement, and just how close in Black liberation theology and how closely these discourses became aligned with Christian vocabularies and Christian figures. But I do think, to our previous points and kind of where this discussion has been going, there are other ways of understanding Black humanity beyond our unfree status and our historical unfree status. And there are ways that Black people have expressed and understood their own humanity that we have to be attentive to as we do our work.
I don't know. I just have to just say I love that answer.
I do too, and I have nothing to add.
It's so beautiful. It's just so beautiful.
And comprehensive.
Comprehensive. It's beautiful. Mm-hmm. It's on point. And so I'm gonna say something, but it's only a footnote. It's only like some massive citation of what Alexis just said, because it's brilliant. But what she said, it is worth just underscoring, at least in my mind, just one more time. I mean, as I wrote in my notes here, I was listening to this, the reference to Sylvester's work, Freedom as a Type of Racial Property. And And I got to thinking, I was like, you know what? See, when slaves ran away, they were running away. We often think about them as running away from bondage. And of course that's true, but I want to suggest that Black folks were fugitive from the freedom that was tethered to the bondage they were running from. They couldn't just be running to the freedom that was bound up with the bondage they were running from. They were running for a freedom that was free from the freedom bondage dialectic. They were running from the freedom, running towards a freedom that is irreducible to the freedom bondage dialectic, which means that the word freedom might not be adequate for what they were doing. And to the extent that we think Black religion, Black identity, so on and so forth, within the logic of the US nation state, for example, in which freedom is the sacred religious ideal. The religion of whiteness is constituted not first and foremost through white skin, but through the sacrality of a thing called freedom, which is constituted through a thing called bondage, through the sacrality of something called property, which works in relationship to this bondage. So that then fundamentally means whatever this freedom is, it has to put some sort of line through it. I don't know, it's a poetics of freedom at that point. The kind of thing we are doing is irreducible to the forms of freedom that have been given to us. And in some sense, it's the critique of freedom, as the critique of bondage, as the critique of property. Or in the book that I have coming out next year, it's what I call the phenomenology of the anarchy of Black religion. Black religion is anarchic to the structure of freedom bondage, and therefore mobilizing the category of freedom as an analytic for what's going on is inadequate fundamentally.
I said I didn't want to say anything, but I tell you, just listening to Alexis and Jay, I'm thinking, oftentimes I talk about how we just assume that because we speak English and many of the documents that we read for the slave period are in English, that we actually have the semantic tools to understand how African descendants were translating cognitive traditions from Africa through English vocabularies, right? And Creole and Pidgin vocabularies. So it's, I'm listening to you all and I'm thinking, kind of like what the Field Sisters do. I actually cite them in my book on this issue. They were using racial language, but they really meant nation, the way I talk about it in the book. They written, not nation state, they really meant nation. They didn't mean race. They were using the language at hand. And as I think about this, in an earlier conversation, Sylvester and I had talked about, because I emphasize kinship a lot in that book, what is the difference between freedom and kinship? Boy, I tell you, kinship is not freedom. It is not that. I can tell you that. And I remember when Nelson Mandela floored Ted Koppel. Some of y'all are too young for this, but when Mandela was released from prison and Ted Koppel thought he cornered him and thought that he was going to force him to denounce his friends like Fidel Castro, and said, but you are, you talk to Fidel Castro and other dictators. And I don't remember, he might've said Muammar Gaddafi. He said, you will never tell me who I can be friends with. You will never tell me who my political allies are. Ted Koppel couldn't speak for like 9 minutes. I don't know, maybe I'm exaggerating, but he could not speak. That's a perfect example of how kinship, which is what Mandela was talking out of, is not freedom. The kind of freedom tied to democracy, the free world that Ted Koppel was talking about. It's a perfect example. And it makes me wonder whether part of the work of this next generation of Black religion scholars, even those who focus exclusively on the Black church, is to retranslate, just like those Field Sisters. We were using the language of freedom, but maybe it was something else. Maybe it was something else. And I tell you, just, listening and looking at what's going on now and hearing some of the Afro-pessimists and Black nihilists in my head, it's like, I had to tell one the other day, now I get why so many theological scholars don't like the Afro-pessimists, because the way we use the word liberation is how you all kind of use endurance. So I have to come up with a new word, a new kind of way to qualify endurance in the book that's coming out. But it's almost as if we need to also go back and look at the integrity of endurance. You know, a lot of times we hear it as those who were trained by the Cone lineage, we hear it as, oh, endure suffering, endure the cross, endure. No, there is some deep, powerful something going on, like as what Jay was saying. And I just wonder if we need to think together as communities of scholars about the actual vocabularies that were being used, the key terms that were being picked up on, sometimes strategically, right, in order to kind of leverage the possibility of citizenship being extended to them. But maybe really need to go in and interrogate those words and come up with something else. And that alone would make us have to re-theorize the Black church, Black churches, Black Christianity, Africana religions as something else. So I am very appreciative of what I've heard to this question, and it's really got my kind of wheels turning right now as well.
Thank you all so much. We have one final question that we can ask, as we only have a couple minutes left in our hour. It goes far too quickly, but it really links into this conversation about both the past and the future of the study of Black religion. And so this question is about Professor Albert Raboteau, who, as you know, recently passed, and his book was Slave Religion was of astounding relevance, and has continued to really shape the study of Black religion. And I'm hoping that you could make some closing remarks on his legacy, but also what it might imply about the future directions of the study of Black religion, sort of the directions that you would like to see moving forward. And Dr. Carter, I'll let you start off with this answer.
Yes, it struck me, hit me a bit hard to learn of Professor Raboteau's passing. In my book, Race: A Theological Account, I have a chapter on Professor Raboteau's work. And I remember when I was working on the chapter and trying to make some sense of what I was doing, I went to Princeton and I visited with him. And the thing that struck me, I mean, I could sort of get a sense of it in the work, but him as a human being, him as his kindness, his gentleness as a scholar, coupled with the intensity, the sharpness of his work as historian, just really has stayed with me through all these years. And so when I learned of his passing, I didn't realize it would affect me, and maybe that's also in the context of, we've been losing a lot of luminaries in Black religious thought. Of course, Professor Cone's passing the last 5 years or so, and then there's the passing of Professor Charles Long last year. That would have been the beginning of 2020, and now Professor Raboteau. These folks, they laid the rudiments in many respects of the kind of second half of the 20th century iteration of what we know as Black religion, the study of Black religion. And I'm using that formulation intentionally, Amy, because there were people who were involved in the study of Black religion before Cone, Raboteau, Charles Long. I mean, of course, Du Bois has been invoked. I'm thinking about Benjamin Mays, Howard Thurman. We can go on. There are many of them, but in the 60s into the 70s, the institutionalization, the bringing of the study of Black religion into the modern U.S. Academy. Al Raboteau was key in what the study of religion was. We mentioned James Washington. He was foundational in how we sort of like cast a historical eye, engage resources, notwithstanding the lessons we've learned from Saidiya Hartman about the complexities of getting into the archives somehow, some way. Professor Raboteau, he took us into the archives. He introduced us into and gave us methods for engaging what within the normative terms of the archive are nothing but invisible because conceived as non-existent and dead. He gave us vehicles and pathways to get into that. And Slavery Religion was this monumental text, but before we got on, I just pulled out some of his other books because, you know, he wrote some other things too. And many times we don't think about those other things. I have one of his books by the handy here. Yeah, here are a couple of them. He wrote Canaan Land, Religious History of African Americans, A Fire in the Bones. This book, he also has another book I couldn't get my hands on really quickly that connects with his own tradition as involved in Eastern Orthodox Christianity, which has some really profound meditations thinking about religious icons and issues of representation and images and so on and so forth, connecting that with African American peoples. The introductory chapter or the preface to A Fire in the Bones, Praying the ABCs, is this really deep and affecting meditation on the relationship between him being a scholar in history, a historian, his responsibility to sources in the archives, and yet trying to think about what's encased, shall we say, in the archives and in the sources that the standard tools of the historian can't quite tap into. He called this faith. And I've heard the word endurance. If we were to like kind of mobilize a word like this, how do these sources encase within them legacies of keeping on, legacies of enduring. And endurance, I also mean things like the capacities to compose, right? To assemble ourselves differently under these terroristic and dastardly conditions of enslavement. All of that is these robust practices of endurance, of compositionality, new assemblages, alternate socialities. And somehow he taps into these even as he's looking at the sources. And I think that we have much to do to sort of think about that dimension also of inquiry into this tradition that we're thinking about. And so my comments are a little bit over the place, but if I were to condense them down, they're all in the interest of expression of profound appreciation for Professor Raboteau, as well as others that we have recently lost, with a particular eye towards this category of faith that he's talking about, not overturning it too quickly, just to say it's the Christian faith, but this kind of capacity to compose, to craft, to make literally a way out of no way, the kind of poetic practice of making the alternative, constructing and composing the alternative, mobilizing resources, not simply to repeat them or to iterate them, but to reiterate them, right? This kind of reiterative kind of process. And so that's what I think about when I think about Professor Raboteau. I'm eager to hear what my colleagues think as well.
Thank you. Yeah, Dr. Stewart, Dr. Wells-Agokome, we don't have much time, but would you like to offer a little bit of reflection on Professor Raboteau's legacy and future directions?
Okay, I can.
Dr. Wells-Agokome first.
Oh, me first? Okay. Yeah, this is, it's funny because I am supposed to write a memorial blog for Dr. Raboteau. And, you know, one of the questions to myself has been, how do you write a memorial blog for someone who completely shaped everything you think about intellectually? I mean, just that's who he was or is. And, you know, Dr. Stewart might remember, I don't know if you remember this, but I went up to Princeton to talk to him while I was writing my dissertation. You know, I think I remember that conversation because one of the things about what of course, Slave Religion is going to be a book that for me was monumental, even though as Professor Carter just pointed out, he wrote other stuff too, you know, but I think what he did in that book, that it was so central to the arc of how Black Christianity, Black religion has been studied is, you know, he married the Du Boisian, you know, typology, preacher, music, and frenzy to E. Franklin Frazier's Invisible Institution. And he created a historical narrative around it and a historical methodology around those two frameworks, which is not easy to do when you're going into an archive that has been essentially untapped for this purpose. And so I think his influence cannot be overstated because we see the imprint of his way of theorizing that moment in time on I think a lot of subsequent work, when people gesture towards the period of slavery, they're gesturing towards slave religion. That's what they're usually doing. And I think for better or for worse, because, I think Dr. Rabbitoe, at least in my conversation with him, he was the first to acknowledge, hey, this was my dissertation. I published it. It was one book in many. Can y'all leave me alone about it? I remember when he was at AAR, for the umpteenth time for a memorial, he said, this is the last one. That's what he announced at the end. He said, no more. But one of the most profound things he ever said, and he said it in that actual panel, is he said, the task of the scholar is always to figure out how to tell the stories of the people you love. And I thought that was that statement for me is a beautiful encapsulation of the sensitivity with which he handled the sources, and then the ways he imbued enslaved people with humanity as historical actors. Because, slaves, as they're oftentimes called, become these kind of nameless, faceless entities, this one monolith. And what he managed to do in his work, it always was to show us, in that work in particular, to imbue them with choice, and describe them as people who made choices, which, one thing that I was always trained to do by my advisor. I always had to point out that the person who trained me is on the call, because she, but one thing, I think all of us who have ever felt her touch have been able to do is to trace the intellectual lineage of a scholar, and think about where they're situated within this broader field, this broader kind of constellation of scholars who are shaping discourse. And again, Dr. Rabbitoe, oftentimes when you're doing that, it's small steps that make huge impacts. Du Bois linking the religiosity of enslaved people to Africa, small step, but huge. And it's like a wave that cascades and changes how people start to talk about the subject. And it's the same thing with Dr. Rabbitoe's work. And the final thing I want to say very quickly in terms of the future field and direction, going back to Dr. Carter's previous assertion about the other books, he took intellectual risks. He wrote about other things. He inserted himself and did these reflective things in the narrative, which are, I would argue, intellectual and methodological risks that we're oftentimes not encouraged to take. And I think that's the future. The future is encouraging grad students and those of us who are out, no matter what stage in our career we're in, to take those risks, to follow the leads, even if it's something that we have to retrain ourselves in, because sometimes that's where you get the excitement as a scholar, but that's also where you're creating new inroads and kind of carving these canyons that hopefully other people, creating these streams that other people will take up, and there will be other tributaries. So my final point, about Dr. Rabbitoe is just, to echo his amazing humanity and the ways at which he remained a teacher at every stage in his career. He certainly challenged me when I was writing my book, but did so with such a gentle touch that I almost didn't know it was happening. But he also took risks. And I think that's the future, one of the futures of our field, encouraging our students to step out on that limb methodologically, to think of different mediums through which we can find to express knowledge as vehicles. These are all ways, we can encourage, I think, new pathways and new epistemologies, new methodologies in the field. Sorry for the long answer.
Beautiful answer.
Could I say something very briefly to that? Can we think about what the field of African-American religion studies would be without slave religion? What it would even look like, what it would, I feel like the first voices that I heard of African descendants speaking about their religiosity came through slave religion. I mean, maybe it didn't, but that's the book that I think of when I literally heard them talking about themselves. And the reason I could do that was because of the privileging of the archive. So I'll go back to something that I've said elsewhere in print. We had 50 years of sociological dominance, 50 years of theological dominance. Where are our religious historians? Where are they? We don't, just what Rabateau did and some of the students he's trained and others who have done historical work. We have some, but we don't have that historical dominance that we need in the field of African-American religious studies. We don't have it, and we need it. You know, I am 100% convinced that the materials are there just because of things I've picked up along the way in the archives and in other kinds of material culture from the past, artifacts, etc., to tell us stories that we still don't know about African-American religious history, including the slave period. They're there, but most of us are not training to be historians. And so we can't know. I mean, I'll talk about an intervention that Catherine made in Obia Studies. I mean, the way I got to know Catherine, the article was so darn good that I was like, I gotta find out who this person is and get in touch with them. I mean, and the way she was able to make this intervention, which validated so much of what I said in my book, 3 Eyes for the Journey on Obia, is because she was going to the early Moravian documents. Who would have thought that we really do need German, y'all? All those arguments about why we should do Spanish and French as our languages. No, we need German. We need German, but it's an old form of German, Catherine showed us, right? It's that old German that those Moravians were speaking. She learned it. She went into those archives and boy, and she sent me some stuff. She's like, Diane, I don't even know what to do with this stuff. I still have it. I'm going to work with it, Catherine. Things that I have never seen before. Africans talking about their religions in the homeland to these Moravian missionaries drawing pictures and symbols. And I'm just like, what in the world? So we need the historians. And what did she show? Exactly what I said in 3 Eyes for the Journey. I didn't do that careful work. I didn't go, because I'm not the historian. So I didn't go into the nitty gritty of it. I started with the Moravians, but I didn't go into that archive, right? And what does she show? That this is a tradition of doctrine. It's about healing. Primarily about healing. Yes, there is a weaponry and warfare a repertoire of Obia, which I'm also very much interested in, but the healing and health care repertoire has often been eclipsed by the colonial construction, the colonial imagination of Obia. And Catherine's article just blew that out of the water. And it's only the tools of the historian and doing that careful archival work that allowed her to do that and say, here's the precedents, because this is the earliest, these are the earliest records we have. And we don't see any record about Obia being attached to evil from the Emic Africans themselves. Oh my goodness. I was just like, I need to make this a holiday when I read that article. I said, my goodness. So what I say, we need our historical dominance. Please, everyone, I know we do need more womanist theologians because a lot of the womanists are going into ethics and, you know, practical theology because they care about what's happening in the pews with Black women and girls in the community. So we do need more womanist theologians. But honestly, as a theologically trained scholar, can y'all do history, please? Can some of y'all just do history? We need historians to do this work. We need to find new historical sources, archives of material culture, and we need to revisit other sources that other people have revisited with new lens that are influenced by deeper knowledge of the peoples, the religious traditions and cultures of the African continent. When we have that knowledge, we can read those sources differently. And we need to read those sources differently if we take seriously that the Africans who disembarked in the United States and elsewhere didn't just overnight acculturate to their new conditions. They were Africans in the Americas. And to understand their world, we need to understand what was happening on that continent as well. So that I come on, historians, I say historical dominance. We're waiting for the historians to dominate, go through those archives and give us something new. We need it.
That's a fitting tribute to Rabateau's legacy and contributions, with lots to think about on the future of the field. I want to thank with Catherine to thank our panelists and discussants. I want to also give special thanks to Professor John Butler and his role in organizing this, Professor Andreas Sturck and the Department of History at the University of Minnesota for organizing this event, to Christopher Saladin, who is at work right now making sure all of our technical and digital platforms are in order to make this possible. Thank you so much. Thank you all of our listeners and audience for joining us this evening. And we are really grateful for your time and attention. This is a great opportunity to really explore some of the important themes that emerge through the Gates documentary on the Black Church. So thank everyone and have a good evening.